We're on DAF Yutes Amud Aleph. We're starting the new parak, and not that much shkolim left, but we'll get through it. There'll be a siyum Amir Tzashem on Thursday of next week, a week from Thursday.
We want a lot of shkolim,
and we'll do a siyum on psachim and shkolim.
Well, lots of shkolim, I'm saying. There's not much left. Lots of shkolim.
Okay, so the Mishnah now says, Ma'os shenimtzu bein hashkolim linedava. The topic of our Mishnah is what happens if you walk into the temple area where these 13 pushkas are and you find money on the floor. And so it depends. If you find money bein hashkolim linedava, between the shkolim pushka and the nedava pushka, so what should you do with it? So karav lishkolim yiplu lishkolim linedava yiplu linedava. So obviously, if the coins are closer to the shkolim pushka, you can assume that they came from the shkolim pushka. If they closer to the nedava pushka, you can assume they're from the nedava pushka. Mechza lemechza yiplu linedava. But if it's half and half, if it's equidistant between the two pushkas, so then you have to be machmir and put the coin in the nedava pushka. Now that's counterintuitive when you think about it, because which one is more chamer, the shkolim or the nedava pushka? The nedava pushka is for voluntary offerings for the kayetz hamizbeach when there's downtime. But the shkolim are for the purchase of obligatory communal karbanos. So if anything, you would think that the shkolim pushka is more important. So you should put the money in the shkolim pushka. So the Gemara will have to deal with that. Let's go on to some other things. Bein eitzim lelavona. Well, let's say you find a coin between the wood pushka and the lavona pushka, the frankincense pushka. So karav leitzim yiplu leitzim, lavona yiplu lavona. So obviously, whichever one it's closer to is where it came from. But mechza lemechza. But if it's equidistant between the two, yiplu lavona. That should fall into the lavona pushka. Now that is intuitive because lavona is placed on the altar on the fire itself. Eitzim is just an accessory to the carbon. It's the fuel for the carbon. So therefore it makes more sense to do it for the higher purpose. Bein kinin legozale ola. Now, if you find coins between the kinim pushka and the gozale ola pushka, if you remember, there was a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Both agree that the kinim and gozale ola are pushkas for bird offerings. Rabbi Yehuda felt that they were both ola birds. Both the kinim pushka and the gozali ola pushka are for ola birds exclusively, and the chachamim felt that the kinim pushka is for one for ola, one for chatas, and the gozali ola pushka is exclusively for ola. So karov lakinim yiplu lakinim, karov legozali ola yiplu legozali ola. Like we said before, wherever it's closer to is where it came from. But mechza lemechza yiplu legozali ola. But if it's half and half, it should go into the gozali ola pushka. Now, ostensibly, the reason would be is that I would imagine, because since the kinim birds are less expensive and the gozali ola birds are more expensive, they're more chashava birds, maybe that would be the reason why you would automatically put it into the gozali ola pushka. The question, of course, is going to be, how can you convert something that's meant for a chatas into an ola? That's something that we'll have to analyze in the Gemara. Bein chulin l'maiser sheni. Now here we're not talking about the 13 pushkas in the Beis HaMikdash anymore. Here we're talking about any time you have two boxes that have coins in them, and you find a coin on the floor in between the two of them. One box contains chulin coins, and the other box contains Meiser Sheni coins. Meiser Sheni coins, of course, are coins that you have redeemed the kedusha of your Meiser Sheni produce onto the coinage, and that coinage has to be brought up to Yerushalayim and consumed. So, karov l'chulin yiplu l'chulin, Meiser Sheni yiplu l'Meiser Sheni. Of course, whichever one the box the coin is closer to is where you have to assume it's from. But mechza l'mechza yiplu l'Meiser Sheni. But if it's equidistant, then you have to be machmir and give it the kedusha of the Meiser Sheni coin. Zeh klal, and the general rule therefore is as follows: holchen achar hakarov lahakel, mechza l'mechza lahachmir. When your coin is closer to its point of origin, it's closer to one box over another, you always assign it to the closer one. But if it's exactly equidistant between two, then you assign it the more machmir status of the two boxes, or of the two receptacles. Okay?
Machmir is most holy.
Whichever one is more holy, whichever one has has a more stringent halachic status as far as its treatment.
They could have said that statement without all the examples.
Well, that's a good point, Alan, but the Mishnah wants to list things that are not necessarily completely intuitive. Some of these examples are not completely intuitive, and the Gemara will address that momentarily. Lo hutzracha de lo ben shkalim lekinim. So the Gemara's first question is, why specifically these examples? If you remember, when we learned the Mishnah about the 13 pushkas, we first learned that the first pushka was the new shkalim, the second pushka was the old shkalim, the third one was the kinim pushka, and then we listed at the end the 6 nedava pushkas. So why are we talking about finding a coin between the shkalim pushka and the kinim pushka? They're all the way down the row from them. It's much more likely to find a coin between the shkalim pushka and the kinim pushka than finding a coin between the shkalim pushka and the nedava pushka. How could you ever find a coin between the two of them if they're so far apart from each other, separated by other pushkas? So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Abun b'shem Rabbi Pinchas kamin buchliar, and some have the girsa kamin kobliar or kovlayim, and hayu osin, that the pushkas were in a circle, and because the pushkas were in a circle, depending upon where in the circle the coin was found, it could be equidistant between the shkalim pushka and one of the nedava pushkas. And so that's the reason why we're addressing that. And it's telling you a chiddush that even though you would think that shkalim is the more chamer of the two, nevertheless you put it in the nedava pushka. So mechza lemechza yiplu l'nedava. So the Gemara's question is going to be, and I'll read it according to the girsa of the Korban Ha'eda, lo tzorcha ela mechza lemechza yiplu l'shkalim. The Mishnah doesn't make sense. It should have said that if you find them equidistant between the nedava pushka and the shkalim pushka, you should put it in the shkalim pushka because that's more chamor. So the Gemara gives two answers. One answer is, as some would choose to answer, is that when you find a shkalim coin, could either go for the Trumas Halishka or it could go for the Shiare Halishka. If you remember, what did they do? They scooped out coins with these 3 boxes 3 times a year, and only the coins that were in the box would go for Karbanos Tzibur, would go for communal Karbanos. What did you do with the rest of the coins that were left over, the Shiare Halishka? That would go for Bedek Habayis, for temple upkeep and repair. So on the one hand, the coins that make it in the Trumas Halishka are of a holier status than the Nedava coins. But on the other hand, there's an equal or greater chance that this coin is not going to make it into the Trumas Halishka, but it'll be part of the Shiari Halishka, which means that it's of a lower status because it's for non-sacrificial purposes. And therefore, from a statistical standpoint, you're better off putting it in the Nedava Pushka, where 100% of those coins go for the purchase of Karbanos. So that's one answer. And another answer is Istaboy Meimor Mechza Lemechza Kamishames, that there's the opinion that once you've dislocated the owner from the coin, because the coin now is considered to be ownerless coins, or a coin, let's say, from a person who's deceased that he set aside for his machatzis shekel, where does that coin go? It goes to Nedava. So therefore, by default, since we don't know who the owner of this coin is, we put it in the Nedava Pushka. That's the other answer. Amar Rabbi Yasa, Ada'ana Taman, Shamoyis Kal Rav Yehuda Sha'al Lishmuel. When I was in Bavel, I heard Rav Yehuda ask Shmuel the following question. Hifri Shkalo Vameis, and this Gemara is really just illustrative of this point, that when you have a machatzis shekel where the owner has died, what do you do with the coin? If a person set aside his shekel and then he dies, Amar Le Yiplu L'Nedava, and Shmuel said to him, it goes to the Nedava Pushka. Asiris ha'efa shalo. What if a Kohen Gadol had set aside his tenth of an ephah that he's supposed to bring on a daily basis to the temple as his offering? He sets it aside and then he dies. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yolichem Liyam HaMelach, Rabbi Lazar Amar Yiplu L'Nedava. So there you have a machlokes, whether the flour has to be completely destroyed by throwing it into the salt sea, the Dead Sea, and Rabbi Lazar says no, that money goes to the pushka. But the bottom line is the point of bringing this Gemara is to illustrate that when you have surplus shkalim coins which are ownerless, the surplus goes to the Nedava pushka. So now the Gemara asks another question. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that if you find a coin that's equidistant between the kinim pushka and the and the Ola, what was it called? The Gozole Ola Pushka. So the money goes to the Gozole Ola Pushka. So according to the Chachamim, this is problematic, because if the coin came from the Kinim Pushka, then at least part of that coin is meant for a korban chatas. V'yesh chatas kreva ola, question mark? How could something that is meant to be a chatas be instead brought as an ola? That's the question. So Chizkiya, or Rebbe Chizkiya b'shem Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Tanai Beistin hu ala mosaros sheyikarvu olos. The answer is that this is what we would call moser chatas. It's like we said, it's like it's an ownerless coin, and whenever you have an ownerless korban chatas, or you have a surplus of money that was set aside for a korban chatas, normally we say that that money has to be thrown into the Dead Sea, and you can't benefit from it, you can't do anything with it. But here, the Beis Din made a specific tanai that this is the exception to the rule. That in the event that there's money that's found in the temple, and there's a possibility that that money was meant for a chatas, Beis Din, using their power of hefker, Beis Din hefker, of being able to liquidate someone's assets and make that money hefker, basically said that we remove we remove that stigma off of this chatas coin in order for it to be used for a productive purpose. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, you've been able to mitigate the problem of a chatas coin being used to purchase an ola sacrifice because of a special condition that the Beis Din put on this particular scenario. But ha'isha hazos ba'mehi miskaperes. But how is the woman who meant for this coin to go for the purchase of her sin offering for after childbirth or after tumah? How is she going to achieve atonement if there was no korban chatas that was brought for her? So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Tanai Beis Din hu hamasapik es hakinin hu masapik es hapsulos. Answers the Gemara, this too was part of the stipulations of the Beis Din. They made a standard rule and said, anytime you find a coin in the Beis Hamikdash where there's a safek that it's meant for a korban chatas, we're going to use this coin for purchasing a korban ola, and the bird provider, the person, the vendor who's in charge of providing birds to the Beis Hamikdash, will be notified that we had such and such amount of money that is a safek chatas, and he has to provide us with free birds to cover that cost, and that'll be brought misafek. That'll be brought on behalf of a woman, and he has to absorb that cost. That's the rule, that if you want to be a vendor of birds for the Beis Hamikdash, you've got to be prepared to take that loss as well. That's part of the cost of doing business with the Beis Hamikdash. What do they call it? Shrinkage? In the big industry they call it shrinkage. But no, this is not shrinkage. This is just like a coin was found on the floor. We don't know. There's a suffix that it may be a chatas coin, so therefore the vendor has to make up for the cost of that, for the value of that coin in birds. So now the Gemara says, let me ask another question, another generic question, which goes to Alan's issue. Lo tzorcha de lo ben ketoris la'etzim le'lavona le'zahav le'kapores. Why did the Mishnah only list these particular cases? There are many other cases of where a coin could be equidistant from two pushkas that presents us with the same issue. What if you find a coin that's equidistant between the ketoris and the ketoris pushka and the wood pushka? What if you find a coin that's equidistant between the Lavona pushka and the pushka that's meant for the purchase of klei shares, of ministering vessels? Why doesn't the Mishnah discuss those cases? So the Gemara says, but v'tanisa b'sofa zeh haklal holichan achar hakarov mechzel hachmir. The answer is that that's what the last line of the Mishnah is for. When the answer is obvious, that you go after the more machmir pushka, so all of the other cases are very obvious. The ones listed in the Mishnah are not so obvious, that's why the Mishnah listed them. But the other ones, these for example, these two cases, you find a coin that's equidistant between the ketoris pushka and the eitzim pushka, so it's obvious that it goes for the ketoris, because the ketoris is sacrificial and the eitzim is only accessory to sacrificial. If you find something between the lavona and the gold pushka, then obviously it goes for the lavona, because the lavona is sacrificial and the zahav pushka is only for the purchase of klei shares. So again, that would fall under the general statement of the last line of the Mishnah. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Now you should be somewhat, this should jog your memory just a little bit, because we went over this case very carefully when we learned Maseches Psachim. Just as a general prelude to this Mishnah. people would, in general, bring money with them to when they would make aliyah l'regel. What kind of money did people bring with them? They brought all different kinds of money, but predominantly the money they brought with them to spend was Meiser Sheni money. If you were a farmer and you had accumulated a whole bunch of coins that the Kedusha of your Meiser Sheni produce had passed on to these coins, you wouldn't make a special trip to Yerushalayim to buy food with these coins. You would say, I'm going on Pesach, I'm going on Sukkot, I'll be up in Yerushalayim, so I'll bring that money with me and I'll spend it there. Now, what would you do with that money? What would you do with that money? You'd buy food. What kind of food would you buy? First of all, you're only allowed to buy food. You're not allowed to buy any other kinds of non-consumable goods. So what would you do with that money? So typically, you would use that money to buy animals. You would bring the animal as a korban shlamim, so that only a small portion would end up on the mizbeach. And you'd get to eat a nice big dinner with your family and friends of an entire animal, and you'd get to keep the hide. So it was beneficial for you to be able to purchase a korban shlamim. So therefore, once you have that scenario in your head, that people making aliyah l'regel brought a huge amount of cash that was generally Meiser Sheni cash up to Yerushalayim at every regel, you'll understand the Mishnah much better.
Years only now, Meiser Sheni.
What?
Was in certain years. Meiser Sheni was in
No, Meiser Sheni is every year except Shemitah. Yeah, you're thinking of Meiser Sheni is in most years, I should say. It's 4 out of the 7 years. You're right. The third year and the 6th year, it's Meiser Ani. So you're right. But in most years, this is you'll see it. Since it's in most years, it's 4 out of the 7. So then, this is why these halachas are relevant. So ma'o shenimsu lifnei sochrei behema. If money is found in front of animal vendors in Yerushalayim, so then olam meiser. So then you can assume that the money is Meiser Sheni money. And it's a good point that Shlomi is raising. What if it's a Meiser Ani year? The Mishnah does not distinguish, I guess because you go after the majority. See, here's the thing, is that even though the money that is you find on the floor could have fallen from the vendor, in which case the Kedusha has been removed because it's now in the vendor's possession, but nevertheless, in most cases, money that falls in front of a store is from the buyer, not from the vendor, because the vendor is usually more careful to put it in the cash register. So therefore, you can assume that this money fell from the buyer's pocket, the consumer's pocket, and therefore you can assume that it's Meiser Sheni money, because the vast majority of people of cash that exchanges hands at the vendor's shop is Meiser Sheni money when it's in Yerushalayim. And that's true.
That you didn't have to bring to Yerushalayim.
No, not at all. But this is true, doesn't matter what time of year it is. It could even be not during Aliyah L'Regel, because when you leave after Aliyah L'Regel, any surplus cash that you have, sometimes you would have a huge agricultural enterprise, and you have thousands and thousands of dollars of Meiser Sheni money. You'll leave it with your friends and family that are living in Yerushalayim, and they'll spend it out slowly over the course of the year. So therefore, any time of year, doesn't have to be during the Yontif, that you find money in front of the vendor, you assume it's Meiser Sheni money. Uvahar habayis chulin. Anytime you find cash on har habayis, then you can automatically assume that it's chulin. And the reason why you automatically, and that doesn't matter what time of the year it is, and the reason is because even though the majority of cash that comes up during the Yontif is Meiser Sheni cash, but the majority of cash circulating throughout Yerushalayim, not in front of the korban animal vendors, but just in the regular shukim, is non-Meiser Sheni. Because the residents of Yerushalayim are not carrying around with them typically Meiser Sheni money. It's only when you need to purchase an animal for a korban, that's where you have Meiser Sheni money prevalent. But in the rest of Yerushalayim, there's not Meiser Sheni money prevalent, and therefore if there's a coin on Har Habayis, that coin, in greater likelihood, came from the pocket of a Yerushalmi who has Ma'os Chulin. And that's true even if that money is found during Chol HaMoed on Har Habayis. And the reason is because you have no evidence when this money fell out of the guy's pocket. It could have fallen yesterday, and it could have fallen out of his pocket 2 weeks ago. So therefore, we go Basar Rov, we go after the majority of money that's in Yerushalayim, and not going after any time-related issues, and we assume that it's chulin.
What's the Avamina if it was Chulin or Why would you have thought that during Chol Hamoed?
No, because during Chol Hamoed you've got thousands of people coming from outside Yerushalayim with Meiser Sheni to spend.
Oh, I see.
Okay. Uvi Yerushalayim. Now in Jerusalem, in the rest of the streets of Yerushalayim, not on Har HaBayis and not in front of the animal vendors, so then it depends. B'sha'ar kol yemos hashana chulin u'v'sha'as haregel kol meiser. If you find the money in the street in Yerushalayim during any time of the year that's not Chol HaMoed, so then you can assume it's chulin. But if you find it on Chol HaMoed, so then you have to assume that it's Meiser Sheni money. And the reason is because the streets of Yerushalayim are swept daily. So therefore, if you find money in the street today, it fell out of someone's pocket within the last 24 hours. So therefore, you have to assume that if you find the money on Chol HaMoed, this is from today. This is not from a week ago. And therefore, since it's from today, and the majority of cash currently circulating today through Yerushalayim is Meiser Sheni money, because we've got all of these hundreds or thousands of people that are from Chutz Yerushalayim with Meiser Sheni money to spend, so then we assume it's Meiser Sheni money. Next, Basar Shenimsa Ba'azara. Now, in a similar kind of situation, if you find meat in the temple courtyard, of course you can assume it's kosher meat. The question is, what carbon does it come from? So olos, so then you have to assume, since the animal has been dismembered in a way where it doesn't look like the limb is meant for eating, but it's rather meant for just to be dismembered for the altar, you have to assume that it's meant for a korban ola. Now, v'chatichos chataos, if it's cut up into cuts of meat, like it's cut up into steaks, so then you have to assume that this was meant for a korban chatas, the more machmir of the korbanos that are edible. Uvi Yerushalayim, if you find a piece of meat in Yerushalayim, zivchei shlamim, then the cut of meat you have to assume would be from a shlamim. Now, does that mean that you can go ahead and just eat it? No, not at all. In all cases, you have to wait for the meat, whether it's the limb or the steak, you have to wait for it to pass its expiration date. Now, for an ola and a chatas, the expiration date is only until the next morning. And for a shlamim, you have to wait 2 days in order for it to pass its expiration date. And only then are you allowed to burn it. Because since you don't know for sure that it became tameh, but there's a chashash that it became tameh, you can't burn it right away. You have to wait until ibur tzura, till it goes past its expiration date. Now, the point here is that there's something called hesech hadas. There's something called an interruption in my focus on this object. Anytime you have kudshim meat, where a person has hesech hadas, where he doesn't know for a few minutes what happened to that meat, you have to be choshesh that it may have been exposed to tumah, even if it's inside the temple, and therefore you're not allowed to consume it. You have to assume that perhaps something happened to it to taint it, and therefore you have to wait till ibur tzura and then you burn it. Nimsa b'gavulin evarim nevelos v'chatichos mutaros. Now let's say you're outside of Yerushalayim, where no karbanos are allowed to be taken. No sacrificial meat can be taken. So if you find an animal dismembered into limbs, but not cut into cuts of meat, so then you have to assume that this animal is a nevela, and it's being prepared to be, the carcass to be thrown into the street for the dogs to eat. That's typically how you got rid of a dead carcass that was a nevela. However, if it's cut into cuts of meat, like steaks, so then you can assume that it was just slaughtered for personal consumption, and it's a kosher piece of meat, because of course in Eretz Yisrael all the food is kosher, right? So even wherever you go in Israel, the food is kosher, as everybody knows, right? I'm speaking tongue in cheek, of course, but in the times of the Mishnah, you're allowed to make that assumption. In the times of the Mishnah, everywhere in Eretz Yisrael, the meat is kosher. So of course, you find meat on the ground. Of course, what? But assuming that it's in a Jewish neighborhood, then you're allowed to assume it's a kosher piece of meat.
You have different provisions, like we have different.
So we're going to see how we get to our kosher standards. This would never pass the COR standards. Trust me, because the halacha has changed since then. Uvishas haregel shahabasa meruba af evar mutaros. And if you find this meat during the Shalosh Regalim outside of Yerushalayim, so then where there's a predominance of meat all over Eretz Yisrael, so even if you find it a dismembered carcass, there too you're allowed to assume it's kosher. You don't have to assume it's nevela, you can assume it's kosher because everyone's using meat and it may have just been temporarily dismembered, preparing it to be cut into steaks. The Gemara now says...
Just a quick clarification. The meat that you leave to expire to burn, it's not burnt on the mizbeach, is it?
No. Beis hasreifa means it's burnt outside the temple, right? In a pyre, like a big pile of wood. Lo tzurcha de lo bahar habayis kodesh. So the Gemara's question is, I don't understand. You told me in the Mishnah that if you find coins on the Har Habayis, you can assume it's chulin because you go after the rove of people who are dwelling in Yerushalayim at any given time, and most of that money is chulin money. But 1 second, why don't you have to be choshesh that maybe that money is hektish money? Maybe it was donated to the temple, and after all, like the Korban Ha'eda says, there's a halacha that you're not allowed to come up to the Har Habayis with your wallet. So why would a person be carrying a coin anyway up to the Har Habayis? So there's 2 counts against you. Number 1, it's unlikely that it came from someone who was walking up to Har Habayis with coins in their pocket. And number 2, what about the fact that it may have come from the hektish treasury? So you should have to treat it like a hektish coin. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Ba, Rabbi Chia, B'Shem Rabbi Yochanan, Chazaka, Shein HaKoin, Motzi Min Halishka, Mos, Ad Shu Mechalon Al HaBehema. The answer is that we know that the Kohanim who are in charge of the treasury are so careful with the money that's in the treasury that they would never take out a coin out of the treasury unless they would first profane it and pass its kedusha onto an animal. So you never have to worry if any coin ever made its way out of the temple confines and it made it to Har Habayis. You can rest assured that that money was nifta, its kedusha was redeemed off of it, and therefore the money is chulin. So there is still the possibility that a stray person may have brought up a coin up to the Har Habayis from his home, and there's also the possibility that it came from the temple, but in either event it's going to be guaranteed to be chulin. Basar shanim sechule, if meat is found in the azara, so Reb Elazar b'shem Reb Hoshia hisia das tone ibur tzura. He said that there's a halacha that anytime you're dealing with kodshim meat and you have a hesach hadas, you lose track of where the meat is even for a short period of time, then you have to wait for it to expire and then you burn it. Amar Rabbi Hoshia masnis and Amar came. Rabbi Hoshia says, well, that's our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says, you wait for the expiration to occur, and then you burn it on the pyre. So Amar Rabbi Yossi, v'yeyos. So Rabbi Yossi says, I'm learning like the Korban Ha'eda, who says that this is being asked as a question. Oh, really? Can you really bring this as proof from our Mishnah? I might be able to learn the Mishnah differently. Maybe I'll tell you that when you find meat in the Azara, it's different from when you have a piece of meat that you know the origin of this meat and you just have a Hesach Hadas. Because maybe when you find meat in the Azara and you don't know where it originated, La'achlo inat yachal shema niskalkel tsuraso. Maybe the reason for our Mishnah is because when I find meat and I don't know what its origin is, maybe when I find it, maybe it's already been laying out for past its expiration date. How do I know where this meat came from? And because I don't know where this meat came from, maybe the whole reason that the Mishnah requires me to do Ibur Tzura is because maybe already Ibur Tzura is already expired meat. But in reality, from our Mishnah, you don't know the halacha about Hesach Hadas, because maybe our Mishnah would argue that if you know that this meat did not yet have expiration and you just lost track of it for 5 minutes, maybe the Mishnah would acknowledge that it's okay. So that's why, even though that's the way we explain the Mishnah, but you don't necessarily see proof from it from our Mishnah. Okay, Nimtza Bigvulin. If you find the meat somewhere outside of Yerushalayim, so you know for sure that it's not sacrificial, Rabbi Crispa, b'shem Rabbi Yossi, what a name! In the name of Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, Evarim nevelos lokin alehem mishum nevela. So we said that if you find dismembered limbs from a carcass, then you assume that it's nevela. And what his point is that not only do you assume it's nevela, but you are so certain that it's nevela that you give the person who eats it malchus. It's not just that it's a safek nevela, it's vadai nevela. It's a chazaka that it's a nevela. Masnisa amrakein, and our Mishnah is indicative of that because it says, Evari nevelos v'chatichos mutaros, because it says that if you find dismembered limbs, so then it has a din of nevela, and if you find cuts of meat, then it has a din of being mutter. So chatichos mutaros lo mamish udekavase varim nevelos lo kin aleihem mishum nevela. So the Gemara basically makes the diuk as follows: just like the second statement is, when you find it as cuts of meat, it's certainly mutter. So to the first part of the statement is that when you find it as dismembered limbs, it's certainly nevela. That's the way that you learn to create parallelism between the second part and the first part. That's the only way to understand our Mishnah. Rabbi Crispa, b'shem Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, im hayu machruzos mutaros. He says, however, the exception is as follows. Let's say you find dismembered limbs from a carcass, and the limbs are attached to each other with string. That's an indication that these limbs are not being prepared to be thrown out to the dogs. That's an indication that these limbs are being preserved by the owner in order to be able to bring home, to cut up into steaks, and to serve to his family. And therefore, you don't even have to think twice. It's for sure that these steaks are kosher, and you're allowed to eat them. Teisha chanuyos mochros basar nevela ve'echas mocheres basar shchuta nischalfu lo choshesh v'lanimtzeis holchen achar harov. Now this is the famous case of Teisha chanuyos, which is the subject of much discussion in Maseches Chulin and in other Masechtos. And if you've ever learned the famous Sefer Shav Shmaitza, then you know that this is a discussion in the Achronim as well about how to deal with the concept of kavua versus parish. This is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. It's not completely intuitive, but listen to the halacha. The halacha is that if you have an object that is found amidst a bunch of things where there's Isser and Heter, and you don't know the status of the object itself, so then you give it a 50-50 status, even if there's a much greater chance that it's Asr, or a much greater chance that it's Mutter. So, for example, there are 10 butcher shops on this block. I walked into one and I bought a piece of meat. And I got amnesia, and I don't remember which butcher shop I walked into. I just don't remember which butcher shop did I buy this piece of meat from. That's called kavua, because I walked into one of the shops, and I don't know which shop I walked into. That's called where I went into the source of the meat, and I myself took it out. So in that situation, regardless of whether there's 90% of the stores are kosher or 90% of the stores are treif, we give this piece of meat an exactly 50-50 status. It's a suffix, and therefore if I eat it, I don't get malkus, but it has a din of nevela. That's called kol kavua kemechza al mechza dami. That anything that is from a fixed place where the source of the Isser and Heter is, and it's taken out from there knowingly by a human being, so then you give it the status of 50-50. The contrast is kol de parish merubub kaparish. If I find a piece of meat outside the 10 butcher shops, I don't know how it got there, and I just find it in this setting that way where it's been removed already from one of the butcher shops, and I don't know which butcher shop it was removed from, then I say that look at the majority of stores, and that's the status of the meat. So if the majority of the stores are nevela, so then the status of this meat is vadai nevela, and so to the point where I believe if I eat it, I would even get malchus. But if the majority of the stores are kosher butcher shops, and there's only one store that's not, so then I'm allowed to go ahead and eat this piece of meat, and it gets the status of being a kosher piece of meat.
The first one, you're assuming that some are not kosher of the 10.
In both cases, we know that some are kosher and some are not kosher. That's universal. So in our first case, therefore, in the first case, if you have 9 stores that sell treif and 1 store that sells kosher, so if you bought a piece of meat and you don't remember which shop it came from, holchin achar harov, you go after the you choshesh, then you give it a 50-50 status. It's called kavul kemechza mechza. V'lanimtzeis, but if it actually you found it in front of the stores, holchin achar harov, then you go after the majority and you give it the vadai status of nevela. Teisha, in the converse case is Teisha chanuyos mochros basar shchuta vechas macheres basar nevela. If 9 stores are kosher and 1 store is treif, so then nischalfu lo choshesh. Then if you bought it from one of the stores and you don't remember from which one you bought it from, is kol kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami, and you give it a 50-50 status, you can't eat it, of course. But if you find a piece of meat in front of the 10 stores, holchen achar harov, you go after the majority. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now let's talk about this piece of meat that's been traveling and we don't know exactly where it came from. Hanimsa biyad nachri kenimsa bepaltia. That if you find a piece of meat in a Jewish neighborhood being transported by a non-Jew, then that's as good, that's as kosher as meat that's found in the butcher shop, in the kosher butcher shop, and the meat is kosher. Based on the assumption that since all of the butcher shops in town, or even the vast majority of butcher shops in town, are kosher, the fact that a goy has a piece of meat under his arm still makes it kosher because we assume that it was purchased from the butcher shops in town.
He found it? The goy found it, or just had
it?
No,
all we know is the statement of the Gemara. The Gemara simply says, you find it in the hands of the Gentile. Gentile says, here, Reb Shloima, have a piece of meat, and he doesn't tell you where it came from. You're allowed to assume that it's kosher. Rabbi Elazar be Rabbi Chagai have a mesamech le Rabbi Mana Amana. The Gemara now tells you a story that Rabbi Elazar was supporting Rabbi Mana as they were walking, and Chama lechad armoi mekatea minsuse umapik lebra, and Rabbi Mana sees a non-Jew. He got a horse that just died, and he's cutting up a piece of the horse's carcass and throwing it out into the street. So he says, Amar lei, hada hida Amar Rabbi Yochanan hanimse siyad nachri kenimse bepaltia. So he says, based on what he saw with his own eyes, he said, how could Rabbi Yochanan say that if you find a piece of meat in the hands of a non-Jew, you can assume it's kosher? What if it's a piece of horse meat? How do you know where that meat came from? So to your issue, Shlomi. So Amar lei, Kain Amar Rabbi Yossi, Vehein Shiro Osu Yotze Mimakulin Shel Yisrael. So he qualified the halacha. Rabbi Yochanan was not saying that any time a goy presents you with a piece of meat, you can assume it's kosher. No. It's where you saw that the non-Jew had walked out of a kosher butcher shop with a piece of meat under his arm, and you lost track of him. You don't know where he went. Later in the day, he comes to your house and he presents you with a piece of meat. You can assume that the meat that he came out of the butcher shop with is the same meat that he's presenting to you, and you don't have to be choshesh that he switched it for horse meat. That's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. But if Stamazoi, a non-Jew, presents you with a piece of meat, and you don't know the origin of this meat at all, so then you're not allowed to accept it. Now, here's another story. Chad Barnosh, Bitziporin, Ozel Boy Mizban Kopid Min Tabcha, Velo Yoavle. There was once a guy who was living in Tzipori, and he wanted to buy meat from a certain butcher in Tzipori. The butcher refused to sell to him. They had some kind of feud between the two of them, and the butcher said, no meat for you. Okay? So Amar Lei, Lechad Romi, Va'aisile. So here's what he did. This Jew had an idea, this Yankel, right? He said, you know what I'll do? I'll get a non-Jew, this Roman. I said, do me a favor, sir. Go and buy a piece of meat from the store. Don't tell him it's for me. And you'll sell it to you, and then you'll sell it to me. So, Va'aisile. So he does it, and the Roman gives him the piece. This could be like an episode from Seinfeld. And so the Roman gives it to him. The butcher discovers it, and Amar Le lo naspis al korch. Oh, so first the guy who gets the Yankel gets the piece of meat, and he goes back to the butcher and says, ha ha ha, I got you. I got meat from your butcher shop. So Amar Le v'lav basud and avela yahavislei. So the butcher says to him, but I sold it to a Roman. It was treifa meat, right? Jerry, don't you know, right? So Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Chanina. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says the name of Rabbi Chanina, Ma'isa ba lifnei Rabbi va'amar lo kol kula mine meser makulan ditziporin. The butcher is not believed, because since the butcher shops in Tzipori have a status of kosher meat, they're all under the certification of the Rabbanim of Tzipori, no one can turn around afterwards and say, I had treifa meat in my store. You don't believe the guy. Obviously, the guy was only saying it in order to enrage this Yankel who thought he had tricked the butcher. Now, all of what we've seen up until now is based upon the old halacha, but now there's new halacha that is based on what was going on in Bavel. This is all up in Eretz Yisrael. Now let's see how the halacha changed. Rav Nachas Letamon Chamsun Mekilin. Rav went to Bavel, and he noticed that Jews were being very liberal by allowing non-Jews to transport meat for them without taking into regard the possibility that the meat could have been switched along the way, and therefore v'chomer alehen. And he was machmir, and he paskined, and this is how we paskin today, that anytime you have what's called basar shenis ale min ha'ayin, anytime meat is being transported by a non-Jew, and a Jew has not kept track of that meat, the meat is automatically non-kosher. And that's what we require anytime there's transportation of basar, we require chosmos, we require seals on it, so that we have assurance that the same meat that he took out of the kosher vendor is the meat that's arriving at its destination. That's the basis for this halacha. So you see, there was an evolution of halacha. Originally, you didn't need this. You didn't need chosmos on meat. If you knew the goy came from a kosher butcher, you could send him on his truck and send him to the hotel or to the shop or to the restaurant, wherever he was going, and he could deliver the meat, no problem. But Rav saw that there was a disregard and that people were becoming lax and where there was an abuse of this system, and therefore he said across the board, and that's been the halacha since the time of Rav, that basar shenis ale min ha'ayin is aser. Now, Chad Barnash Azul Boy Mishizka Askufte Begav Nahara V'inshasa the Azule Chazer Boy Min Sabina. So what happened was there was a guy who had a piece of meat, a piece of kosher meat. A Jew. Jew had a piece of kosher meat and he wanted to wash it in the river. So he goes over to the river. The river's flowing pretty rapidly, and unfortunately he accidentally drops the piece of meat in the river. He starts running after it, loses sight of where the meat is, and then a few minutes later downstream he finds a piece of meat. And he says, "Oh, Baruch Hashem, I found it." So Amar Le Rav, Asulach, Dina Amar Hahi Shataf Nahara V'Aisi Churi Dinavela Tachtuye. And Rav says, no, it's Aser. You lost sight of it even for a few moments. This could be a different piece of meat that's not kosher, that's nevela, and your piece of meat may be somewhere else downriver, and therefore the meat is Aser for you. That's again called Basar Shenis Ale Min Ha'ayin. We'll hold it here for today.